Greetings all. Welcome to another edition of User Delight with Microsoft Technology. My name is Sanjiv Venkatram, and in this episode, we'll be talking about dynamically creating tables and merging Word documents using Power Platform and Azure functions. Let's get over to the details. Thank you very much. Right. So let's get a walkthrough of the entire solution first. So I have here on the left a simple Power Apps. It could be simple, it could be complicated, completely up to you. And here I'm trying to actually generate a quote for, in this particular case, a selling of a drone, right? So I have a gallery here from which I can make selections. And once I make selections and I actually save this, it gets saved in Dataverse. From there, we head on over to SharePoint, and in SharePoint, I've got essentially three folders, right, on a site. So one of the folders holds the basic quote template, the Word document, and we'll get to the details in a second. And then in another one, I've got the corresponding artifact. So this could be technical details of the quote, it could be terms and conditions, whatnot. So there are two basic documents. One is the actual quote template, and the other is the document to be merged with the quote template. And then a third folder, business unit, is where the end users are, by business unit, going to access their folders and then find the final quote document, right? So if I were to go to the app and then I'm going to add an item here, I'm going to select, let us say, lighting. Then add another item here, and let's say I'm going to basically select propellers or whatever, right? So I've got 3 line items here, and I'm going to basically go save this to the database. So this goes ahead and then creates the next item, the 5th item. And now what happens is, in a couple minutes, the system comprising of Power Automate and Azure functions run, and they merge all the documents, and it gets saved here to this particular folder. So if I were to refresh this, and we'll give it a minute or so for this to actually run. It takes about a minute for this to run, so let us give it a minute. There you go. So the quote document is actually here, and if I were to open this document, and I'll open directly in the browser, you will actually see that there is a table here that has been dynamically populated. And then if I were to select something else, let us say for the next one, battery or whatever else, it dynamically populates this table. And then this is the main document, and here is the addendum, right? The secondary artifact document. So these two actually get merged. So let us unpack this and see how this is constructed. Well, first of all, in our Power Apps, and if I were to go to Power Apps here again, let us look at the database setup, right? So if I were to go to solutions, and I have my drone quote solutions, in which I have my transaction drone table. And if I were to go look at the columns here, basically, other than the quote number, which could be an auto number, I have 6 other columns, right? There is the item number 1 with the actual name of the item, and then the corresponding value, and so on and so forth, right? So for each particular item, I've got 3 columns: the item number, the item name, and the item value. Now, is this the most optimal way of actually saving data in the database? Maybe not. You could have a secondary table in which you could have the line items listed one below the other. Different strokes for different people. The reason why I'm doing this way is because the customer wanted to see it this way, right? But otherwise, you would actually have a secondary table in which you would have the columns literally normalized, and then you wouldn't have when you do the BI, you wouldn't have to do any transposition and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, here is our table, right? And this is where from we get the data, right? So from here, what happens is, if I were to go over to, let me just see, if I were to go over to Power Apps here, I go to Power Apps, when that row is created, so I have my first starting point here. So when the item is actually added, and this is the table name, and then the scope is organization. I start the flow. Then I initialize a variable, which is, primarily done to get the link to the document so that the people consuming the document, the end users, let us say they're salespeople, they don't necessarily have to go to SharePoint to retrieve the document. They could actually get a link to the document and they can open it. I'll show you that later, right? So here's the link, and this is a variable that holds that link. Then you have the actual Azure function. So here's my Azure function. So it needs a URL. We'll get to this shortly. The method here is post. And then the headers that it actually needs is an application JSON type. And it's essentially like, carrying a JSON body, right, in the content. And the body itself, basically, if I were to look at it, it basically has the site URL to begin with. This is my site URL. And then it has the name of the file name of the quote template. And here is this is the actual quote template, the main document. This one is the document that gets appended to the main document. And then there is a JSON of the items, right? So there is the item number, and the item number is nothing but the first item in your SharePoint, the item number, right? Then you have the item names. So you have the item name, which is name 1. And then you have the value here, which is the item value of 1, right? So in the first JSON over here, the first item essentially gets you, let me go all the way down to that. So this basically gets you the first line item, the 3 columns, the item number, the item name, and then the item value, and then so on and so forth. So if you have more, you just go in and add this JSON here, right? So we construct this JSON here, and then basically you just use a JSON formula, and then you essentially concatenate everything so that it's in one particular list, right? And I'm going to close this because I've already constructed this. And then from there, you go and actually, once this is passed to the Azure function, the Azure function then runs it. And then once it actually runs it and merges the document, you will see shortly that it gives you a link to where on SharePoint the document is. So you have to parse this to get that particular link, parse the JSON, and I'll show you the output shortly. And then once the JSON is parsed, you actually set variable, which is essentially the URL, right? So the output, if I go to parse JSON over here, the JSON comes in as an object, and it's got, the file URL as a property. We don't need the file name, but we need the URL. So we get this, and then we set it in the variable. And once we have this variable, we send an email to the user saying, hey, look, hope you're well. And then here is for this particular code number, here is the document link, right? So that completes the process, whereby the user gets an email, and he or she might not actually have to go to SharePoint to retrieve the document, but they could, of course they will have to go to SharePoint to retrieve the document, but the thing is, instead of manually doing it, you can click the link and get there, okay? That's the whole intention behind sending an email. Otherwise, you could just stop here with the HTTP request, and once it actually runs, you just send a notification back saying, hey, look, it has actually run. So if you're just going to do notifications, might as well actually add the link as well. So all of this is in one place, okay? So now let us see how this Azure function is actually constructed. So if I were to now go to, and the Azure function is written in C#, so it's basically a .NET program. So I'll head on over to my .NET right now. So I'm going to make this bigger. So what I would do is I would go in, create a new project. And in this new project, I would actually go create an Azure function project here. And then in the Azure function project, I'm going to give this a particular name. And then it has got a particular local repo in which, this gets saved. And then if I were to click next here, I will basically select .NET 8 long-term support, isolate it, and then an HTTP trigger, because that's exactly how the function is being triggered. And then when you run this in the real world, in my case, I run it as anonymous. But when you run it in the real world, you will actually select function as the authentication type. What this forces you to do is that it forces you to actually pass a token, and then the function actually runs. I would highly recommend you actually do this. We'll do a separate video on it. But I highly recommend you actually do this, because in the enterprise context, when you run something from Power Automate, not everybody should be allowed to run it. And from the outside, let us say, if you're going to run this, if a hacker were to run this from Postman, let us say, they should not be able to authenticate if they don't have access, right? I mean, they should be able to, they could make the request, but the request is going to be denied because they don't have the permissions, is what I'm trying to say. Essentially, that is limited to whoever actually has access to the solution. Okay, so Power Automate will not run this. Azure will not call the Azure function if it is if the person is not authorized to run it. Okay, so that's it. And then I'm going to actually cancel this because I've already created the function out here. So what are the libraries or dependencies that you would actually need to, once you get this going, what dependencies do you need? Well, you need Azure Identity for sure, for being able to get your credentials, being able to actually run this whole code, right? So for function for logging in, right? Then you have the XML, the two, there's, I think, just the document XML, right? And then this one is to open and manipulate the Word documents, access to specific Word elements like, the tables and parameters and so on and so forth. Then you have the one for completely to run the Azure function, the core functionality, if you will, right? So you have your Azure Core SDK, and then you will actually have your the worker extensions basically that handle the HTTP requests and interactions also with your M365. So this is what I'm talking about here. So these packages here, this XML gives you these two libraries that allow you to actually access your Word document and the details within it. Then you have your HTTP request with Azure functions, right? And Azure Core here, this one is your core functionality within the Azure SDK, these two, okay? Then for any login, logging of errors and so on and so forth, you have a library for that. Then you have Graph to be able to access SharePoint. And this is where, before accessing Graph, you would have to validate or the access and authorization you would actually have to do within Azure, within Azure Entra ID, Active Directory. You go in and set up an app registration, and in that set up the right permissions. That will give you a client ID and a client secret that you pass to this code, and it actually connects to Microsoft Graph. So not everybody can connect to it, okay? And then you have a JSON library that allows you to deserialize, the JSON. And then you will actually have, for asynchronous progress, you'll have your threading here library, okay? So with this, we get right into the actual function itself, the core functions. You have a namespace here, and then, some standard classes. So you will actually have classes for the site URL, for the actual document, which is the file name. And then you will actually have the artifact name, right? So essentially, these are this gives you, if you will, the main structure, right? The structure of the request, okay? And then you actually have the variables. You'll have the item number, the item name, and the item value corresponding to the columns that you saw. And then based off of this, you go in and then you actually start the function to, merge the documents here, right? So here, what you're basically doing is getting the site URL, getting the file name, and then you're validating it over here that it's not null, right? And this is the request body. And then in the request body, you're basically validating that it's not null. And then you're logging and passing it as a response, if it is, if 400 or 200 or whatever, you're getting the response, the HTTP response. And then out here, this is where you would have actually registered your app. So you have your tenant ID, client ID, and client secret that you pass. And then once you pass, this gets you the access to the SharePoint. So you parse the SharePoint site here, you go in and then construct the path. And then there's again some logging and debugging and logging here. And once you actually do that, once you're, you've got the site, you go in and actually build out the file paths, right? For the quote templates, for the artifacts, you actually get a date and time because you're building out the final document file name. So this gives you the quote and today's date and the docs. This is how you saw the quote name. Of course, you can here add the quote number. You can connect to Dataverse, bring the quote number into your code, and then I would highly recommend you do that, and you add your quote number here as well, including the date and time, right? And then finally, you have the path for the output, which is in the business unit folder, and then the file name. Follow? So then there is a little bit of debugging that you would actually do if there are errors, and then you notify the users appropriately, right? Fail to load or fill the template, so on and so forth. And then finally, you would actually load the artifact document here. So very similar structure. You're basically going in through Graph, getting through SharePoint, and then actually, loading the artifact document. Again, there is, error validation here, failed to load, and so on and so forth. So then what you do is you basically go in and actually merge the document, right? So there is a try and a catch function here. And then what you're essentially doing is using Graph, you're basically trying to create a merge stream. And then there is again a logger to catch any particular errors, right? So then you finally go in and not finally, then you actually go create a link here. So, and that is going to be the link that is going to be sent. We'll see that in the email shortly. So, you have your folder path, you have a base URL, and then you finally get the file URL. So you have the site URL, and then you have the document name, and then finally the path. And then you return the output of this method is going to be a function that returns the file URL here. And then, that's going to be the response out, right? Also, what you do here is fill out the table. And in this particular case, we'll see the Word document. Maybe I should show it to you now. If I were to go to the Word document, let me see where that is. It is here. So if I were to go back to the SharePoint site and go to the library and go to the quote template and open this document here, you will actually see that I've got these tokens laid out, right? Corresponding to how many ever items are there in the database. I've set it up, I've tallied the two together. So if you've got 50 items, you could actually lay this out. This is one way of actually doing it. Another way, maybe for larger documents, is to just loop through this and then not indicate each one, but it just loops through the table, and then you provide an order for it to loop through to say, hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on and so forth. That's yet another way of actually doing this. But for now, we actually just loop through, and then, we have these placeholders, and then in our code, bring the data from your Dataverse and then populate it, right? You're essentially populating these items, okay? So, and then, the whole entire document is actually merged once this happens, merge multiple Word documents over here. So again, you have a method to doing that. It's called merge method over here. And then it loops through again. And then, the process is called as chunking. And what it does is it takes the two documents as individual chunks and then puts them together, and it makes sure that the formatting is retained and there is no error in formatting. Okay. And that's about it. That's all this code actually does. And I'll actually be posting this code in GitHub so you can take this and further process it. And then, you could go to your GitHub Copilot and ask your GitHub Copilot to create this. You just provide it a basic structure and ask it to create it, and it'll do a wonderful job of actually doing that. Let me see if I can get to GitHub and show you. Let me see. GitHub, Sanjiv, Venkatram, 1972. So, and there you go. should be, I wish I could actually show you this. Um, should probably remove the space. Very strange that it doesn't actually show me that. Um, Very odd. There you go, right? So I go to GitHub, and then if I were to go to my Copilot here, I would have a history of this. And let me see, perhaps this could be it. So let me click here. Yeah, this is the one, you see. So if I go up here, I literally provide a prompt saying, hey, look, I have a table in Dataverse. Excuse me. And I've got these following columns, and I have this on SharePoint. I've got like, the site URL and these three. What I want is for you to give me code to, get data from my Dataverse tables, and using Power Automate fill this out. And it goes away and then literally lays everything out, including the actual, the solution in your, in your VS Code, right? So you could do exactly that. In fact, you could take this code and ask it to modify it to, let us say, to include a couple of things. So the first thing you would say is, hey, look, add the, add, let us say, the authentication, right? Right from the get-go, you add a bearer token. The function should be, should be the authentication should be a function. It should not be anonymous, right? That's the first change you would actually make. Then, your method of actually constructing the table, the table of like values, you could, instead of me doing it one by one, you could loop through it. That's the second change you could make. So these are two, primary changes that you could actually make, right? Anyway, so I trust this actually gives you details behind the C# code as well. I'm not terribly sure what this error is. String doesn't contain definition. If I actually, like, it's how do you say, I might have accidentally done something here. I'm not terribly sure. I'd need to actually look at this because I just saw this. Anyway, I'm not going to save this. So the other thing is, if I were to go to the local settings here, the JSON settings, that's where I would have the app registration details. I'm not going to click on it because obviously I've got the details here. But then let me show you where you would actually create it online. So once you have this all done, you would right mouse on this and you would actually publish this, right? So once you publish this, you go in and then you log in. You basically log into your account. You have your profile. So you would have actually created your Azure profile. So, you log in, and essentially when you say publish, it'll ask you, hey, which resource group do you want to publish it to? And you're done, right? In fact, what I would recommend is that you go over to your Azure. So I'll go to my Azure portal here. And then let me sign in here. This might ask me for authentication on my authenticator. I'm not terribly sure. Let's actually see. Takes a minute or so for this to log in. Okay, looks like no. So essentially, if I were to go to the function, so I go to my resource group here, and in my resource group, I have the function, right? So what I would actually recommend is that you create this function up front, right? So you go to your resource group, you say create, and then you go in, look for functions, and then you have your function app here. You click on your function app, and then you have your subscription, right? You select your subscription here, go create one. And then, you got different kinds of plans here. I would go with a consumption plan, right? And then what you give it a name, and then you give it a particular run type. So in this case, it's going to be .NET. isolated worker 8, you select your region, and then I would recommend you select something that is closer to you. And then you need a storage account, so you actually go in and select your storage account. So otherwise it creates a new one, but you select one for yourself. And then that's about it. And in authentication here, let me go in. Right? And then you could basically say, hey, look, do you want what do you call a secrets as your authentication type or managed identity? In this particular case, I would actually recommend that you'd probably use the managed identity because that ties you to the Active Directory. With secrets, what you would have to do is store it in a key vault or something, so that, and don't have the secrets actually sitting in the function app. Have it stored in your key vault so that only people who need to have access to it have access. Okay, so that's about it. So if I were to go to my function app here, and then if I were to go to configuration, if I were to go to environment variables here, you will actually see that I have the client ID and secret here in the environment variables. It takes a minute for it to load. You see, I've got the client ID, and then I've got the client secret, tenant ID, client ID, and client secret. So I've got these three here. Now, the idea here is that you wouldn't actually put the actual app registration values into this, right? But instead, you would actually go to Key Vault, store the ID and secret there, and use those values, use those Key Vault values here, because you don't want to actually expose the ID and secret even to folks who have access to the Azure function. That's the whole point, right? And then to get to this, if I were to go to the Entra ID, I would go to, where do I go to? I would actually go to manage here to app registrations. And then if I were to do a new app registration, I'll basically say accounts in this organization only. I would highly recommend you do that and not cross, tenant boundaries. And then you don't necessarily have to select a redirect URL. You go in and you actually register. When you register, like here, you've got, app registrations that, show up. And there is a video or a link that I could actually give you about this, because these all contain the client secrets. So unfortunately, I can't show it to you here, or maybe I can. Let me actually see all applications, and then let me sort it by date. So the one that I created for this very particular Azure functions right here. This gives you the client ID. It also gives you the tenant ID for my company. But if I were to actually get into the details behind this, there is a client secret that you can actually see. And let me see if I can open this to show you that. So if I were to go to certificates and secrets, so you generate a new client secret, and then that gives you the value, which essentially is your client secret. And if I were to go back here, if I were to click the back arrow here, so you have your client ID, you get the secret from generating the secret, and you have your tenant ID, and that's all you need. You put that in your key vault, and then you go in and access it. If I were to get back here to my Azure function, and then go to environment variables, that's where you get your client ID, secret, and the tenant ID, and then all three of them could be in Key Vault, and you access them here. Okay. So I trust this gives you a whole setup in terms of how do you set up your documents, right? In order for them to get merged, if you want to create tables inside the documents, how do you actually go in and add those documents? So this is what I'm talking about as a summary, right? So you first set this up, right? You first set this up, then you go to your Azure function, start the Azure function, access, create a project in your Visual Studio Code, go in, complete your code, then list in the settings.json, you put in your ID and secret here. Then you go to Azure, and then you create a function, and then you publish from here from your Visual Studio, you publish this entire code to your Azure function. Okay, so the function part is then ready. Then you go over to Power Automate, and then you create your Power Automate flow, and that is, let me go over to Power Automate, and then you create a Power Automate flow. In this particular case, you will actually have all the details relevant to the HTTP code. You will have the function URL, and that essentially comes in from here. If I were to go back, sorry, I digress. And if I were to go back to your function code, and then if you say, get me the function URL, it gives you the URL here. Now, in my case, this is anonymous trigger, right? But in your case, you will actually have to provide the key, right? This key is not visible to you, right? So again, you hide that key within your key vault, and let the Power App actually, access, the token real time, and then run this particular function. Okay. So that's about it. And that sums up the entire, solution. I trust this was helpful. I would highly recommend you look at videos that talk about authentication, that talk about creation of these IDs and then storage into Key Vault. There are plenty of videos on that. I highly recommend you do that, and then you bring it into your code. Okay? I trust this helps. Thank you very much.